I rented the cabin in late October, near the end of tourist season, when the trees had thinned and most of the summer homes stood empty. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel road in northern Idaho, surrounded by tall pines and a slope that led down to a slow, dark river. The listing described it as remote but accessible. That was accurate. I could reach it with my sedan, but once I arrived, there were no nearby neighbors in sight. Only long stretches of forest and the steady sound of wind moving through branches. I went there to finish a work project that required quiet and stable focus. I brought groceries for a week, extra batteries, and a 5-gallon container of water in case the well pump failed. The cabin itself was modern in structure, but sparsely furnished. There was one main room with a couch, a small kitchen counter, a wood stove, and a ladder leading to a loft where a mattress lay directly on the floor. The windows were large and faced the river. During the day, the light was clean and cold, and the interior felt calm. The first 2 days passed without issue. I worked at the table near the window and took short walks along the riverbank in the afternoon. I noticed old deer tracks in the mud and the remains of a small fire pit closer to the water, likely from previous renters. The air smelled like wet bark and distant smoke from somewhere deeper in the forest. I assumed it came from controlled burns or another cabin too far to see. On the third evening, I drove into the nearest town, about 20 minutes away, to refill my gas tank and buy more coffee. The town was small, with a single grocery store, a gas station, and a hardware shop. I saw 2 other vehicles at the pump. I did not pay attention to them. When I returned to the cabin, just before sunset, the gravel road felt longer than usual. The light faded quickly once I turned off the main highway. My headlights cut through dust that lingered in the air. As I parked in front of the cabin, I noticed tire tracks on the gravel that were not mine. They were fresh, with defined edges and no fallen needles inside them. They curved slightly toward the side of the cabin before straightening out again. I stood still for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet except for wind and the river. I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground. The tracks did not stop. They continued past the clearing and back toward the main road. It looked as if someone had driven up, slowed down near the cabin, then left. I told myself it was nothing. The road was not private. Anyone could use it to turn around. Still, I felt a shift in my mood. The isolation that had felt peaceful now seemed exposed. The windows, which I had enjoyed for their view, appeared too open. That night, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. I set my phone on the table and kept it plugged in. Around midnight, I woke to a faint crunching sound outside. It was not loud enough to be certain. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, slow and uneven, like boots on gravel. My chest tightened. I stayed in the loft, barely moving, counting seconds between each noise. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. I could not see the door from the loft without leaning over the railing. I did not move. The wood stove had gone cold, and the air inside felt thin. After several minutes, I heard the soft scrape of something against the exterior wall. It traveled along the length of the cabin, then stopped. I considered turning on the lights to make it clear someone was inside, but I did not want to reveal my exact position. I reached for my phone and checked the signal. 1 bar. I opened the emergency call screen and kept it there. The sounds did not return. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a shallow sleep. In the morning, I climbed down carefully and approached the door. I opened it slowly. The clearing looked unchanged at first glance. The sky was pale and cloudless. I stepped outside and walked the perimeter. Near the front wall, I found a long scratch in the wood siding about 3 feet off the ground. It was fresh, cutting through the outer layer and exposing lighter wood beneath. Below it, the gravel showed scuff marks and partial impressions of shoe soles. I followed the prints as far as I could. They circled the cabin once, then led back toward the road. The tread pattern was distinct, likely from a work boot. I felt a wave of anger at the violation of my space, but it was mixed with fear. Whoever had come there had not tried to break in. They had walked around close enough to touch the walls. I packed my laptop and considered leaving. Pride kept me there. I convinced myself it was a random person, maybe someone scouting properties or looking for scrap. I drove back to town and stopped at the hardware store. I bought a motion sensor light and a small can of bright spray paint. Back at the cabin, I installed a light above the door and painted a visible mark on the gravel near the road entrance, so I would know if a vehicle crossed it. That evening, I worked until dark. The new light cast a harsh white glow over the clearing. It made the trees beyond it look deeper and more crowded. Around 1 a.m., the motion light snapped on. The sudden brightness cut through the cabin. My heart began pounding before I even stood up. I moved to the side of the window and looked out without stepping fully into view. A man stood near the edge of the clearing, just beyond the strongest beam of light. He wore a dark jacket and jeans. His posture was relaxed, hands at his sides, head tilted slightly toward the cabin. He did not approach. He remained there, still. Time stretched. I watched him for several minutes. He shifted his weight once, then took a few slow steps forward, enough for the light to catch part of his face. He looked ordinary, not masked, not armed. His expression was neutral. He turned his head toward the trees, as if checking something behind him, then walked away the way he had come. The light shut off after a minute. I did not sleep. At first light, I drove to town and went directly to the sheriff's office. I reported the incidents and described the man as clearly as I could. The deputy listened and took notes. He told me that a local man had been reported for trespassing on seasonal properties. He would drive up to cabins, watch from a distance, and sometimes attempt entry if he believed they were empty. He had a history of burglary, but avoided confrontation. My description matched him. Later that afternoon, the deputy called me back. They had located the man, parked along a service road not far from the gravel turnoff. In his truck bed were binoculars, a crowbar, and a notebook with addresses. He admitted to driving up to the cabin twice. He claimed he only wanted to see if it was vacant. I returned to the cabin once more to gather my things. The clearing looked the same, but my sense of it had changed completely. The scratch on the siding remained visible, a thin pale line across the wood. I loaded my car, checked each room carefully, and locked the door behind me. As I drove away, I looked at the painted mark on the gravel. It had been disturbed, tire tracks cutting directly through it. That clear evidence, more than the sight of the man himself, stayed with me. It showed intent and repetition. He had chosen that place because it seemed empty and quiet. I never went back. The work I had hoped to finish there was completed at home instead. The cabin had not been haunted or cursed. It had simply been isolated, and isolation creates opportunity. The explanation was direct and documented. A man had targeted empty properties for theft. I had been present when he expected no one. The fear I felt came from a knowledge that the barrier between safety and intrusion was thin, defined only by a locked door and a thin wall of wood in a clearing surrounded by trees. I drove up to the cabin in late October, 2 weeks before the first heavy snow usually closed the service road. My uncle had owned the place for years. After he moved into assisted living, the property sat empty. I volunteered to check the roof, drain the pipes, and bring back a few tools he still talked about. The cabin stood alone on a ridge above a narrow lake, surrounded by pine and birch. No nearby houses, no cell service once I passed the last paved road. I liked that kind of quiet. It felt clean. The structure was small but solid. One main room, a loft with 2 mattresses, a narrow kitchen counter, and a wood stove bolted to a sheet of metal. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. The windows were old but intact. I unlocked the door and stepped into cold air that smelled of dust and dry wood. The place felt closed up, but not ruined. I opened the windows for a few minutes to let it breathe. The first afternoon went as planned. I climbed onto the roof and cleared pine needles from the metal seams. I checked the chimney cap. I walked the perimeter and looked for animal damage. I noticed tracks in the dirt near the back wall. There were boot prints, not fresh, but not washed out either. The treads were sharp enough to show pattern. I paused and studied them. My uncle had not been here in months. I assumed a hunter had wandered up to look at the lake. The land was not fenced. I told myself that was normal. Inside, I swept the floor and wiped down the table. I brought in firewood from the small shed. The shed door hung open when I found it. I was sure I had closed it after taking the first load. I stood still and listened. Nothing moved except wind through branches. I shut the door firmly and slid the rusted latch into place. By dusk, the air turned colder. I lit the stove and watched the flames catch. The fire cracked in a steady rhythm. Shadows shifted along the walls. I ate canned soup and a piece of bread I had packed. The silence felt deeper after dark. No traffic, no distant farm noise, only the lake water brushing against stones. Around 9, I climbed into the loft and lay on my back, staring at the low ceiling. I felt tired from the drive and the roof work. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a dull sound. Not loud, not sharp, a slow scrape. I stayed still, waiting for it to repeat. The cabin settled in the cold. Would contracts at night? I knew that. The stove had burned down to embers. I heard the scrape again, closer to the back wall. I pictured a branch dragged by wind. I waited for the pattern of gusts, but the trees were calm. The sound came once more, then stopped. I climbed down and added 2 logs to the stove. My hands shook slightly from the cold floorboards. I walked to the back window and looked out. The moon cast a pale strip of light across the yard. I saw nothing moving. I checked the door. It was locked. I told myself the scrape came from the shed. I slept in short stretches. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt alert. Around 3, I heard a firm step on the porch. Not an animal skittering. A single, solid weight. Then another. The boards creaked in a way I recognized from earlier when I carried wood. I sat up and held my breath. The steps crossed from one side of the porch to the other. They paused near the door. My mind moved through explanations. A lost hiker, a local checking the property, someone thinking the cabin was abandoned. I waited for a knock. None came. Instead, I heard a slow push against the door, testing the frame. The latch held. I felt my heart pounding in my throat. I did not call out. I did not move toward the door. I reached for the flashlight beside my pack and turned it on, aiming it at the door from inside. The light cut across the wood panels. The pressure on the door stopped. The porch creaked again as the weight shifted away. Steps moved off to the right side of the cabin. I tracked them by sound as they went toward the back wall. A faint scrape returned, closer to the ground this time. Metal against wood. The shed. I waited until the steps faded. I stood for a long time without moving. I knew staying inside felt safe, but I also knew I would not sleep without knowing what was outside. After 10 minutes of silence, I put on my boots and jacket. I opened the door quickly and stepped onto the porch, shining the light across the yard. The beam caught the shed door, swinging slightly. The latch I had set was broken. The metal piece lay on the ground. I moved closer. The door hung open by a few inches. Inside, tools were scattered. The small generator my uncle kept on a shelf was gone. I felt a sharp shift in my thinking. This was not random wandering. Someone had watched the place. Maybe they thought it was empty. Maybe they had already taken things before. I scanned the tree line. The light reached only a short distance into the dark. I went back inside and locked the door. I did not try to sleep again. I packed my bag slowly and waited for first light. Every few minutes, I heard distant movement in the woods. Not constant, but enough to keep me alert. I kept the flashlight on and the fire low. At dawn, I stepped outside again. The yard looked ordinary in gray light. I walked around the cabin. Behind it, near the corner, I found fresh boot prints in soft soil. They matched the older ones I'd seen earlier. They led from the tree line to the shed and back. I followed them a short distance into the woods. After about 30 yards, I found a small clearing where someone had camped. A flattened patch of grass, a few empty food wrappers, and tire tracks from a small off-road vehicle. The tracks led deeper into the forest toward an old logging path. The realization settled in clearly. Someone had been using the area as a temporary base. They likely believed the cabin stood unused. My arrival interrupted that routine. The night visit was not to harm me, but to check whether I had left. When they saw light and heard movement inside, they backed off and took what they could from the shed instead. I returned to the cabin and loaded my truck. Before leaving, I took photos of the prints and the broken latch. When I reached cell service, I contacted the county sheriff and reported the theft in the campsite. An officer later told me they found a stolen generator matching the description during a separate investigation tied to illegal hunting on private land. The tire tracks matched a vehicle already under watch. I did not go back to the cabin alone after that. My uncle decided to sell the property the next spring. The isolation that once felt clean now carried a different weight. The fear I felt that night was not imagined. It was a clear response to a real presence outside the walls. Knowing exactly what happened did not erase the memory of those steps crossing the porch in the dark, but it grounded them in fact. The cabin was not haunted. It was simply unguarded in a quiet place where someone believed no one would notice. I was 7 the last time I saw the cabin. That summer had felt longer than any other. The days had stretched in a way that made time feel heavy, like the air itself had weight. My father had driven us there in his old pickup, the one with the cracked vinyl seats and the faint smell of oil that never left. The road had turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Trees had closed in around us, their branches leaning overhead. I had watched them pass through the window, one after another, endless and silent. The cabin had appeared without warning, just sitting there between the trees. It had been smaller than I expected. Plain, weathered wood, a single window at the front, a door with peeling paint. I remember my father getting out first. He had stood there for a long time, looking at it. He had not said anything. We stayed for 2 nights. I remember the smell inside. Dry wood, dust, something else underneath, something faint and sour. I remembered waking once during the night and seeing him sitting in the chair near the door. He had not been asleep. He had just been sitting there. We never went back. He sold the truck 2 years later. He never mentioned the cabin again. Not once. He died when I was 26. The key had been in a small metal box with other things he kept but never used. Old papers, receipts, a watch that no longer worked. The key had been wrapped in cloth, separate from everything else. I knew what it was. I waited 2 years before I went. It was summer again. Same heat, same heavy air. I drove alone, using old notes I had found among his things. The roads had not changed much. The gravel still crunched under the tires. The trees still leaned in close. When I saw the cabin again, it looked smaller than I remembered. Time had worn it down. The wood had turned gray. The roof sagged slightly at the center. The window was cloudy. The door still stood. I parked and sat there for a while, looking at it. The silence felt thick. No cars, no distant sounds, just wind moving through leaves. I got out and walked toward it. The ground was uneven, dry grass and patches of dirt. The air smelled like earth and heat. Up close, the cabin showed its age. Cracks ran through the boards. Rust stained the hinges. The window glass had small fractures spreading from one corner. I reached the door. The key fit. The lock resisted at first. I turned harder. It gave suddenly, with a dull click that sounded louder than it should have. I pushed the door open. The smell hit first. Dry wood, dust, rot. The inside was dim. Light came through the window in a narrow beam, cutting across the floor. Dust moved in the air. The room was empty except for a chair against the wall and a narrow table. Both looked older than I remembered. The wood had darkened. The surfaces were rough. The floor creaked under my weight. I stepped inside fully and closed the door behind me. The air felt trapped, stale. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust. That was when I saw the marks. They covered the wall near the door. At first, I thought they were cracks in the wood. Age, damage from time. Then I stepped closer. They were scratches. Thin, deep, hundreds of them, all at the same height, about shoulder level. They ran in clusters, overlapping each other. Some were shallow, others had cut deep into the wood, exposing lighter material beneath. They were not random. They had direction, vertical mostly, some curved slightly. Others were straight, all concentrated near the door, not spread across the cabin, not anywhere else, just there. I reached out and touched one. The edge was rough, sharp, not recent. The wood inside had aged, turning dull and dry. These had been there a long time. My chest felt tight. I stepped back and looked at the pattern as a whole. They formed an area about 4 feet wide, starting near the door frame, extending outward, dense at the center, thinner toward the edges, like something had stayed in that exact position, like something had tried again and again. The chair behind me made a faint sound as I shifted my weight. I turned and looked at it. I remember my father sitting there, facing the door, not sleeping, just sitting, watching. I walked around the room slowly. The floor creaked in familiar ways. The table surface was scarred with knife marks and dark stains. The window frame had warped slightly, leaving a thin gap at one corner. I checked the rest of the walls. Nothing. No scratches anywhere else. Only that one spot, near the door. I crouched and examined the lower part. The scratches stopped cleanly at a certain point. They did not extend to the floor. They stayed within reach of a standing person. The spacing between them varied slightly. Some were grouped close together, others spaced apart. I ran my fingers along several of them. They were consistent in width, not wide like a tool blade, narrow, like fingernails. That realization settled slowly. I stood and turned toward the door itself. The inside surface was intact. No scratches there, only the wall beside it. I stared at the handle. It worked smoothly. It opened easily. Nothing about it suggested it had ever been stuck. Nothing about it suggested it had ever trapped someone. But the scratches were there. I stepped outside for air. The heat hit me immediately. The smell of dry grass. The sound of insects. I bent forward, hands on my knees, breathing slowly. My eyes moved around the clearing. The trees stood still. No movement beyond the wind. Then I noticed something else. The outside of the cabin wall. Near the door. There were scratches there too. Fewer. Harder to see. Faded by weather. But present. At the same height. I stepped closer. They were similar in shape and depth. Facing inward. Toward the door. I moved around the cabin, checking each side. Only that one wall had them. Inside and outside. Same height. Same pattern. Something had scratched from both sides. I went back inside. I stood near the marks again, studying them carefully, trying to understand. My father had brought me here once. He had stayed awake that night, watching the door. He had never returned. The memory of that night came back clearer than before. The way he had looked tired but alert. The way he had positioned the chair close enough to reach the handle. Ready. I looked at the scratches again. There were too many to count. Hundreds. They had not been made in a single moment. They had been made over time. Repeated attempts. Repeated failure. I walked to the chair and sat down in it. It creaked under my weight. From that position, the scratches were directly in front of me. Exactly at eye level. Exactly where he would have seen them. Exactly where he had watched. I imagined him sitting there, night after night, watching the door, not sleeping, not leaving, waiting. The thought formed slowly. Not something trying to get in, something trying to get out. I stood suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. I turned toward the rest of the cabin. It was small. One room. No basement. No hidden spaces. Nothing beneath the floor but dirt. Nothing above but the roof. No place for anything to have been trapped. Unless it had been trapped by the door itself. Unless someone had locked it from the outside. I stepped back toward the door and examined the lock closely. It was simple, old, reliable. It could be locked from outside with the key. It could not be opened from inside without turning the handle. Unless the handle had been tied. Unless something had prevented it from turning. I checked the floor near the wall. There were faint indentations. Small depressions worn into the wood. In front of the scratched area. Like someone had stood there often. In the same place. Shifting weight. Moving slightly. Over and over. I stepped outside again and closed the door. I locked it. I stood there holding the key. The cabin looked quiet. Still. The scratches outside faced me. At shoulder height. Someone had been outside too. Scratching inward. Trying to reach the door. Trying to open it. The realization came fully then. My father had not abandoned the cabin for no reason. He had left because he understood what had happened there. Someone had been locked inside. Someone had tried to get out. Someone else had been outside, trying to get in. Both trapped on opposite sides, neither able to reach the other in time. The scratches told the entire story. Panic, desperation, time passing, strength fading, eventually stopping. I looked at the key in my hand. He had kept it all those years, wrapped carefully, hidden away. He had never thrown it out. He had never gone back, because he knew what those marks meant, because he knew exactly what had happened at that door. I put the key in my pocket and walked back to the truck. I did not look back again. The cabin stayed where it was, silent, empty, but no longer a mystery. Just a place where someone had been trapped between two sides of the same door, scratching until they no longer could. I took the job because it paid well and required no social contact. The owner lived overseas and needed someone to maintain his off-grid property for 3 months. He wanted the solar system checked, the water system monitored, and the place kept in working order. He made it clear the property sat alone, miles from any paved road. He sent maps, written instructions, and a transfer for the first month before I even arrived. Everything felt organized and serious. Nothing about it seemed careless. The cabin stood on a slope surrounded by dense forest. Pine and spruce covered the hillside. The air smelled clean and dry. The road leading up to the place was narrow, uneven, and rarely used. Grass grew through the center of it. It took nearly an hour of slow driving from the nearest town. When I first arrived, I noticed the silence. There were no distant engines, no voices, no aircraft overhead. Only wind moving through branches and the occasional crack of wood settling. The cabin itself was solid and modern. It ran entirely on solar power. Panels stood on metal frames beside the structure, angled toward the open sky. A battery bank sat inside a locked compartment on the side of the cabin. The owner had labeled everything clearly. Each breaker had a number. Each wire had tags. Inside, the cabin was clean and simple. Wooden floors, a small kitchen, a desk near a window, a bedroom with a firm mattress and thick blankets. The water system drew from a deep well behind the cabin. A pump powered by the solar system pushed water into a storage tank elevated on a metal stand. From there, gravity fed the water into the cabin. The pressure remained steady. There were no leaks. Everything functioned exactly as described. Behind the cabin, about 40 feet away, stood a storage shed. It was smaller than the cabin, but built with the same materials. Plain wood walls, a metal roof, a simple hinge door with a latch. The owner had left one unusual instruction. He told me never to go near that shed. He did not explain the reason. He did not include any maintenance tasks involving it. He only wrote the instruction once in his message, separate from everything else. He had written many other notes about equipment and procedures, all precise and practical. That single line stood out. I assumed the shed contained private belongings or fragile equipment. The request did not seem unreasonable. I had no reason to question it. My first 5 days followed a steady routine. I woke early. I checked the solar output display inside the cabin. I verified battery charge levels. I inspected wiring connections and mounting brackets. I walked to the well and confirmed the pump cycle operated normally. I checked water clarity. I cleaned the cabin. I recorded readings in a notebook the owner had left behind. The weather stayed calm. The forest remained still. No vehicles passed. No visitors came near. Each day, I saw the shed behind the cabin. It stayed closed. The latch remained in place. I never walked close to it. I stayed focused on my assigned tasks. On the 6th morning, something changed. I stepped outside to check the solar panels as usual. The sky was clear. Sunlight fell across the hillside. I walked the same path I had followed every day. That was when I noticed the shed door. It was open, not wide open, only slightly, just enough to create a narrow gap between the door and the frame. I stopped walking. I knew with certainty that it had been closed before. I had seen it closed every day. The latch had been down. The door had been flush against the frame. Now it was not. I stood still for a long time, looking at it. There was no wind strong enough to open it. The air was calm. The ground showed no signs of disturbance from animals. No tracks, no broken branches. I told myself there was a simple explanation. Wood expands and contracts. Hinges shift. Gravity pulls. Still, I felt tension in my chest. I walked slowly toward it. Each step felt deliberate. The ground was dry. Pine needles crunched softly beneath my boots. The cabin remained behind me, quiet and unchanged. As I approached, I noticed the latch hung loose. It had not broken. It simply hung open, no longer holding the door in place. I reached the entrance and looked inside. The shed was empty. There were no shelves, no tools, no boxes, nothing attached to the walls, no equipment on the ground, only dirt. Bare dirt covered the floor. At first, I thought that was all there was. Then I noticed the grooves. They were deep and clear, parallel lines carved into the dirt. They ran from the back of the shed toward the doorway. I stepped closer. The grooves were wide, several inches across. They were spaced evenly apart. They ran straight. They did not wander or curve. They looked like something heavy had been dragged repeatedly along the same path. The dirt between the grooves was compressed, flattened, hardened from pressure over time. I crouched down and examined them more closely. They were not fresh. The edges were worn smooth. Dust had settled inside them. Whatever had caused them had moved through that space many times, and every time it had moved toward the cabin. I stood up and turned back toward the cabin door. The distance between the shed and the cabin suddenly felt shorter than it had before. I walked back slowly, following the invisible path between the two structures. There were no grooves on the ground outside, only inside the shed. That detail stayed in my mind. The rest of the day, I continued my tasks, but my focus remained on the shed. I kept replaying the image of those grooves. That night, I locked the cabin door. I had not done that before. There had never been a reason. The next morning, I checked the shed again. The door was closed. The latch hung in place. I walked closer and inspected it. It looked exactly as it had during my first 5 days. I did not open it. I returned to the cabin and began checking the interior more carefully. I inspected the floor near the entrance. That was when I noticed faint marks. They were subtle, easy to miss. 2 parallel scuffs across the wooden floor. They led inward from the door. They stopped several feet inside the cabin. I knelt down and ran my fingers across them. The wood surface felt rough in those spots. The finish had worn away. The marks were old, not fresh. I followed their direction. They led toward a large rectangular rug in the center of the room. I pulled the rug back. Beneath, it was a metal hatch set into the floor. It was flush with the surface, painted to match the wood. No handle visible from above. I had walked over it many times without noticing. I examined the edges. There was a small recessed grip on one side. I hesitated before touching it. Then I lifted. The hatch opened slowly. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. The air rising from below smelled stale and dry. I retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I stepped down carefully. The staircase led to a small underground room reinforced with concrete walls. The space was empty except for a large metal container positioned against the far wall. It was rectangular, heavy, industrial. 2 parallel metal runners extended from beneath it, aligned with the grooves I had seen in the shed. The runners continued beneath the container and ended at the base of the staircase. The purpose became clear immediately. The container had been dragged between the shed and this underground room. Repeatedly, the grooves in the shed floor had been made by these runners. I examined the container closely. It was locked with a thick steel latch. Scratches covered its surface. Deep scratches, concentrated around the edges. They were not random. They showed repeated contact with hard surfaces. The container was too large for one person to carry. It had to be dragged. That explained the grooves. I did not open it. I did not touch it further. I climbed back upstairs and closed the hatch. I replaced the rug exactly as I had found it. I stood in the cabin, thinking. The owner had instructed me never to go near the shed. He had not mentioned the hatch. He had not mentioned the container. He had not mentioned any of it. But the evidence was clear. He had been moving that container between the shed and the underground room. The shed had been a staging area. The underground room had been storage. And the movement had happened many times. Over many years, I left the property that same day. I documented everything with photographs. The shed grooves, the floor scuffs, the hatch, the container. I sent the images to the owner along with a message explaining what I had found. He never replied. He did not send further instructions. He did not request my return. The payment stopped. Months later, I learned through public records that the property had been sold. No details were listed about the underground room. No mention of a container. But I understood enough. The shed had never been empty. It had been part of a system built to move something heavy, something that the owner had wanted hidden beneath the cabin. And for reasons I never fully understood, on that 6th day, the shed door had opened on its own, revealing the truth he had worked to conceal. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that had not been graded in years. Grass grew through the center strip, and the tire tracks that remained had hardened into uneven ridges. My tires pressed over them slowly, the suspension creaking as I eased forward. Pine trees crowded both sides, their trunks thin but tall, rising straight and close together. Their branches blocked most of the sky. The air grew cooler as I went deeper, and the smell of dry needles and soil replaced the faint scent of asphalt from the highway behind me. I had not been there in almost 3 years. The cabin belonged to my uncle before he died. After that, it stayed unused. My father kept meaning to check on it, but he never found time. I finally decided to go myself, thinking it would be simple. I expected dust, maybe insects, maybe small animals nesting inside. Nothing more. The cabin came into view suddenly, as it always had. It stood on a slight rise. Its wooden walls faded from sun and weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The front porch leaned forward by a few degrees, enough to notice if you looked straight at it. One of the porch steps had split along the grain. I parked beside the cabin and shut off the engine. The silence settled quickly. It was complete and heavy, broken only by a faint rustling high in the trees. No distant traffic reached that place. No nearby houses existed for miles. I stepped out and stood still for a moment, taking in the scene. The cabin looked the same as I remembered, but something about it felt less stable. The wood had darkened. The windows reflected the trees like blank eyes. I walked onto the porch carefully, testing each step. The boards creaked under my weight, dry and hollow. The front door remained closed. The lock showed rust around the edges. I took out the key my father had given me and slid it into the keyhole. It resisted slightly before turning. The sound of the lock releasing echoed louder than expected. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit first. It was not just dust or mold. It was the smell of stale air trapped too long, mixed with something faintly sour. I paused at the threshold, letting my eyes adjust. The interior looked mostly unchanged. A small table sat near the center, with 2 chairs pushed unevenly beneath it. The old couch remained against the wall, its cushions flattened. The stone fireplace stood cold and empty. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but not evenly. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The floor creaked beneath my boots. Light entered through the windows, thin and pale. I walked slowly around the room, taking in details. The table had less dust on one side, as if something had rested there more recently than the rest of the surface. At first, I assumed it was my imagination. Dust patterns could be uneven for many reasons. I moved toward the small kitchen area. The cabinets hung slightly open. I was certain they had been closed the last time I visited years earlier. I opened one fully and saw empty shelves except for a single metal spoon. It lay near the front edge, not buried beneath dust. I stared at it longer than I expected. It did not make sense for the spoon to be that clean compared to everything else. I checked the sink. The metal basin showed faint streaks, as if water had dried there at some point, leaving marks. A quiet unease began to form, not sharp but steady. I told myself it could have been animals. A raccoon could open cabinets. A bird could enter through a broken gap. It was not proof of anything else. I continued inspecting the cabin. The bedroom sat behind a narrow doorway. The bed remained in place, its mattress thin and covered in an old sheet. The sheet had wrinkles that did not match the way I remembered leaving it. One corner hung lower than the others. I stepped closer. The dust on the sheet was disturbed in a wide area near the center, as if something had pressed down repeatedly. My chest tightened slightly. I turned and looked around the room. Nothing else moved. No sound reached me except the faint shifting of branches outside. I stepped back into the main room and noticed something near the fireplace. A cigarette, but lay on the stone edge. It looked recent. The filter was not yellowed with age. It was still pale, with only a faint gray discoloration. My uncle had never smoked. I stood there for several seconds, staring at it. The cabin did not feel abandoned anymore. It felt paused. I checked the windows. All of them were closed. None were broken. The back door remained locked from inside. I walked outside and circled the cabin. The ground behind it showed patches of disturbed dirt. At first glance, it looked random, but the more I studied it, the more it resembled footprints that had softened over time. A cold feeling settled deeper in my stomach. Someone had been there. I returned inside and closed the door firmly. I considered leaving immediately. My car sat only a few steps away. I could drive back without delay. But I hesitated. It was still afternoon. Sunlight filled the space. Nothing moved. I convinced myself that whoever had been there was gone. It could have been weeks or months ago. A hiker, a hunter, someone passing through. I decided to stay long enough to clean and assess the condition of the cabin. I opened the windows to let fresh air inside. I swept the floor slowly, pushing dust and debris toward the door. As I worked, I noticed small details that reinforced the same thought. A faint scuff near the doorframe at shoulder height. A small indentation on the couch cushion that did not match its natural sag. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted. Shadows stretched across the floor. The forest outside grew quieter. I began to feel exposed. The windows that let in light also allowed anyone outside to see in clearly. I closed them one by one. I decided I would stay the night, then leave early in the morning. I locked both doors and checked them twice. Darkness came quickly. The cabin had no electricity, so I used a flashlight and a small lantern. The lantern cast weak yellow light that left corners in shadow. I sat on the couch, listening. Every small sound carried weight, would settle with faint ticks. Wind moved through branches. The cabin responded with soft creaks. At some point, I noticed something that did not match the natural pattern. A faint pressure against the porch. It was subtle, not loud, just enough to register. I held still. The sound did not repeat immediately. Minutes passed, then it came again, a soft shift like weight on wood. My heartbeat accelerated. I turned off the lantern, leaving only darkness inside. I moved slowly toward the window and positioned myself beside it. Through the glass, the forest looked black and flat. I waited. A shape moved near the edge of the porch. It was not clear, but it blocked part of the faint starlight. Someone was there. They remained still for several seconds. Then the shape shifted toward the door. The door handle moved slightly. It stopped. The person did not force it. They stood there silent. I stayed frozen beside the wall, barely breathing. After a long time, the pressure on the porch eased. The weight lifted. The shape disappeared into the darkness beyond the cabin. I did not move for nearly an hour. Eventually, I heard faint movement farther away. Branches shifting, leaves compressing under slow steps. It faded completely. I did not sleep. At first light, I left immediately. I did not pack carefully. I only took what I had brought and stepped outside. The forest looked normal again, calm and empty. I drove away without stopping. Later that week, I reported what I had seen to local authorities. They investigated the area and confirmed signs of someone living in abandoned cabins across that region. They found makeshift sleeping areas hidden in crawl spaces and attics nearby. Food scraps, cigarette remains, personal items left behind in haste. One cabin less than a mile away contained a worn sleeping bag and empty cans. The occupant had fled recently. The pattern matched what I experienced. Someone had been using my uncle's cabin as shelter. They had likely watched me arrive. They had likely stayed nearby, waiting for darkness, expecting to return to the space they had been using. The clean spoon, the disturbed bed, the cigarette, all of it fit. They had not forced entry that night because they knew someone else was inside. I never returned to the cabin again. My father sold the property months later. What stayed with me was not the fact that someone had been there. It was how close they had come without my knowledge. How easily they had entered and left before. How they had stood outside the door in complete silence, only inches away, separated by a thin piece of wood and a simple lock. The cabin had never been empty. It had only been waiting. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt road that twisted through miles of dense pine forest. I had not visited it in almost 9 years, not since my uncle died and left it to me. It was never meant to be a permanent home. He had used it for hunting trips and long weekends away from town. After his death, I avoided it. The isolation made me uneasy, and I had no reason to return. That changed when I lost my job and needed somewhere quiet to think. The first afternoon felt calm. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine, and cold soil. The structure looked smaller than I remembered. Weather had worn the wood gray. The porch sagged slightly, and the railing leaned outward at an angle that suggested rot underneath the paint. The windows were dusty but intact. The lock opened with resistance, and the door dragged across the floor when I pushed it inward. Inside, the smell of stale air lingered. Dust coated every surface. The furniture remained in place, exactly as my uncle left it. A narrow couch sat against the far wall. A small table stood near the window. A cast iron stove rested in the corner. Nothing appeared disturbed. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy and complete. I spent hours cleaning. I opened windows, swept the floor, and wiped the table until the wood grain showed clearly again. Each movement echoed. The forest outside remained still. No cars passed, no distant engines, only wind moving through branches. By evening, I felt tired but satisfied. I started a small fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill trapped in the walls. I ate simple food I had brought with me and sat on the couch watching shadows stretch across the floor as the sun disappeared behind the trees. That night, I slept lightly. Every unfamiliar sound pulled me toward awareness. Wood creaked as temperature shifted. Wind pressed against the roof. Branches scraped faintly against the outer wall. None of it felt threatening, only unfamiliar. The next morning, I stepped outside early. The ground was soft from recent rain. My boots left clear impressions in the dirt. I walked a short distance from the cabin, following the old trail my uncle once used. The forest smelled damp. Nothing moved except insects drifting near the soil. When I returned, I noticed something I could not explain at first. Near the porch, beside my fresh footprints, another impression showed in the dirt. It was faint, partially collapsed, but different from my own. The shape looked longer, narrower. I told myself it was old. The rain and soft ground made everything blend together. I convinced myself it had been there before I arrived. Still, I examined it longer than necessary. That afternoon, I continued cleaning. I organized supplies, checked cabinets, and inspected every corner. While working in the kitchen area, I noticed a small detail that unsettled me. One of the cabinet doors hung open slightly. I was certain I had closed every cabinet earlier. I remembered the motion clearly. I assumed it had not latched properly. I closed it again and pressed harder until it stayed shut. That evening, I walked outside once more. The forest had grown darker, thicker with shadow. The silence felt deeper than before. I stood on the porch for several minutes, listening. Nothing moved. When I stepped down, I saw fresh impressions again. This time, they were clearer. They led toward the side of the cabin, then disappeared near the wall. My chest tightened. I followed the line slowly. The ground there was uneven, covered in pine needles and debris. The impressions faded into nothing. There was nowhere obvious for someone to go. I checked the perimeter. No vehicles, no distant figures, no broken branches or signs of recent movement beyond the prints. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak sounded deliberate. Every shift in the wood felt like pressure from outside. I lay still, listening for patterns, try to separate natural sound from something else. At some point, I heard a faint scraping noise beneath the floor. It was subtle, brief, almost indistinguishable from settling wood. I held my breath and waited. The sound did not repeat. Morning brought relief. Light made everything feel explainable again. I convinced myself isolation had sharpened my senses too much. I needed distraction. I decided to inspect the underside of the cabin. The structure stood slightly elevated on concrete blocks, leaving a narrow crawl space beneath. I crouched near the edge and looked inside. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Dirt, rocks, old leaves. Then my eyes adjusted. Near the center, partially hidden in shadow, lay a flattened piece of cardboard. Next to it rested something else. A plastic bottle. It was not old. The surface remained clear, not clouded by weather or dirt. I reached inside and pulled it closer. The cap was loose. My hands felt cold. Someone had been there recently. I searched the crawl space more carefully. I found more signs. A torn food wrapper, a piece of cloth, an area where the dirt had been pressed flat repeatedly. Someone had been sleeping beneath the cabin. I backed away slowly, heart pounding. The forest felt different now. No longer empty. No longer neutral. I entered the cabin and checked everything again. Doors remained locked. Windows stayed closed. Nothing inside appeared disturbed, but the evidence underneath could not be ignored. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. My thoughts moved quickly, focused only on distance. I stepped outside and froze. New footprints stood in the dirt near the porch. They were clear and fresh. They had not been there earlier. They led away from the cabin, toward the trees. Whoever had been hiding beneath the structure had returned while I was inside. They had been close enough to hear me move. The realization left a heavy pressure in my chest. I left immediately, driving down the narrow road without stopping. Days passed before I could think clearly about what happened. I contacted local authorities and explained everything. They searched the area. Weeks later, I received confirmation. A man had been living in the forest for months. He had avoided main roads and stayed hidden. He used abandoned structures for shelter. My cabin had been one of them. He was eventually found several miles away. Learning that brought relief, but did not erase the memory. What stayed with me most was the certainty that he had been there while I slept. He had moved beneath the floor while I lay above him, unaware. He had waited silently while I walked across the room. He had left only minutes before I found a crawl space. I never returned to the cabin after that. I sold it within a year. Sometimes late at night, I think about how close he had been, how thin the wooden floor was between us, how easily he could hear every step, every movement, and how, for a brief time, I had shared that silent place with someone I never saw. The cabin sat alone at the far end of a narrow logging road that had not been maintained in years. Grass grew through the tire ruts, and small birch saplings leaned toward the center as if trying to close it off. I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the underside of my truck. Branches brushed the sides with dry, whispering sounds. The air smelled cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low behind the tree line. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had built it himself in the late 1980s. It was simple, square, and sturdy, with faded brown siding and a metal roof stained darker by decades of rain. He had not visited it in almost 3 years after his health declined. He asked me to check on it before winter, make sure the roof held, and confirm nothing had fallen apart. I agreed because I needed time away from the city and because the place meant something to him. The clearing was quiet. No nearby houses. No distant traffic. Only wind moving through tall spruce and the occasional creak of branches rubbing together. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The ground was soft under my boots. Fallen needles compressed with a dull crunch. The cabin looked intact from a distance. The windows were dusty but unbroken. The roof showed no obvious sag. The front door remained closed, secured with the same heavy padlock I remembered. I unlocked it and pushed inside. The air smelled stale. Old wood, dry dust, and something faintly sour. The interior looked exactly as it had years before. A small table near the window. 2 chairs. A narrow cot against the wall. Shelves holding rusted tools and a lantern. Everything wore a thin gray layer of dust except the floor near the door, which looked slightly disturbed. I noticed that detail immediately. The dust there appeared smeared, as if something had brushed across it. I assumed it was from mice or small animals. Cabins like this never stayed fully sealed. I set my bag on the table and opened the shutters. Weak orange light spilled inside. The clearing beyond looked empty. The silence felt heavier indoors. Outside, wind gave constant movement. Inside, the air remained still. I began inspecting the structure. The walls felt solid. No soft spots. The ceiling showed no leaks. The metal stove remained in the corner, untouched. When I stepped toward the back wall, I noticed another detail. A faint mark on the wooden floor near the rear corner. It looked like a thin scratch, curved slightly, darker than the surrounding surface. I crouched and ran my fingers over it. The wood felt rough along that line, as if something hard had scraped across it. I checked the rest of the floor. Most areas remained evenly dusty. That corner showed lighter patches, as if something had rested there recently. I told myself it was nothing important. Rodents, maybe raccoons. Outside, daylight faded quickly. I decided to stay overnight and finish inspecting in the morning. I had brought supplies and expected the night to pass quietly. I lit the lantern and placed it on the table. Its glow filled the room with soft yellow light. Shadows gathered along the walls and ceiling. The cabin creaked occasionally as temperatures dropped. I lay on the cot fully dressed, listening. At first, only wind and distant tree movement reached me. Then, sometime later, I heard something else. A dull sound, very faint, beneath me. It was not loud enough to identify clearly. It lasted only a moment. A soft shift, like weight pressing against wood. I held still, focusing. Nothing followed. I convinced myself it was the structure adjusting. Wood expands and contracts with temperature. Old cabins made many small sounds. I eventually fell asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke suddenly. No clear reason. My eyes opened to darkness except for faint moonlight leaking through the shutters. I listened. There was again a soft scrape. It came from below the floor, not from the walls, not from outside, directly underneath. My body stiffened. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another sound followed. Slow, controlled, a dragging movement. I sat up carefully. The cot frame creaked under my weight. The sound stopped immediately. Silence returned, complete and heavy. I waited several minutes. Nothing happened. I told myself it had to be an animal beneath the cabin. Many structures had crawl spaces. Animals often nested there during cold seasons. That explanation made sense. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. Morning light woke me. The air felt colder. My breath showed faintly. I stepped outside and circled the cabin. The ground around it looked undisturbed at first glance. Pine needles, dirt, scattered leaves. Then I saw it. Behind the cabin, near the rear corner, the soil showed a shallow depression. Not large, just enough to notice. The earth there looked recently compressed. Nearby, needles had been pushed aside. I crouched and examined it closely. The shape resembled a footprint, larger than mine. I checked the surrounding area. More impressions appeared, faint but present, leading toward the trees. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I stood and scanned the tree line. The forest remained still. I walked back to the cabin and looked along its base. The structure sat raised about 2 feet above ground on concrete blocks. The crawl space beneath remained dark. I crouched and leaned down, peering into it. At first, I saw nothing, only darkness and shadow. Then my eyes adjusted. Something lay beneath the rear section, a shape that did not belong. A bundle. I felt my pulse increase. I moved closer, lowering myself further, and reached inside with the lantern. The light revealed it clearly. A sleeping bag, rolled loosely, dark green, dirty along the edges. Next to it sat an empty plastic bottle, a small metal can, wrappers. Someone had been living under the cabin. The realization hit me fully. The disturbed dust, the sound beneath the floor, the footprints. This was not old. This was recent, very recent. I pulled back slowly, my hands trembling slightly. I stood and listened. The forest remained quiet, but the feeling had changed completely. The isolation no longer felt peaceful. It felt exposed. Someone knew about this cabin. Someone had used it, possibly while I slept above them. I packed my bag immediately. My movement stayed controlled but urgent. I did not want to remain there longer than necessary. Before leaving, I checked inside once more. Near the back corner of the cabin floor, I noticed something else. A small hole. It was no wider than a coin, barely visible unless looking directly at it, positioned exactly above where the sleeping bag lay beneath. I crouched and examined it. The edges looked worn. Someone had drilled it. From below, they could see inside. They could watch the entire room. My chest tightened. I imagined lying on the cot while someone stayed beneath, separated only by thin boards. Watching, waiting, remaining silent. The scrape sounds had been movement, careful, controlled movement. They had been there, not an animal, a person. I left immediately. I locked the door behind me out of habit, though the lock meant nothing now. The drive back felt longer than before. Every turn of the road increased distance between me and that clearing. I reported what I found to local authorities later that day. They investigated the site. They confirmed someone had been staying beneath the cabin. They found additional items hidden nearby in the woods. Food containers, old clothing, signs of long-term presence. They believed it was likely a transient person using remote structures for shelter. They found no one during their search. My uncle eventually sold the property. He never returned after hearing what happened. I still think about that night sometimes. The moment I woke and heard movement beneath me, the quiet scrape of someone shifting their weight, the hole drilled carefully through the floor. I had entered believing I was alone in a forgotten place. I was not alone. I had simply arrived before they returned. The cabin sat alone on a slope above a narrow lake, surrounded by pine trees that blocked the wind, but also blocked any sense of distance. The nearest road ended 2 miles behind me, and the last sign of another building disappeared long before that. I had come there in early November to inspect the structure for my uncle, who owned the land but had not visited in years. He had grown older and less willing to make the drive, and he wanted to know if the roof still held, if the foundation still stood straight, if the place could survive another winter. The air smelled clean and sharp. Pine needles covered the ground in thick layers, and each step made a soft crunch. The cabin itself looked solid from a distance, built from thick logs darkened by age and weather. The roof sagged slightly near the center, but that was expected. Snow had weighed on it for decades. The windows were intact, cloudy with dust, but not broken. The front door stuck slightly when I pushed it open, the wood swollen from years of damp seasons. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The smell reminded me of old wood, dry dirt, and something faintly sour that I could not place. The main room held a small table, 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a storage closet. Everything was coated in a thin film of dust, except for the floor near the stove. That area looked slightly cleaner, as if something had disturbed it more recently than the rest. I noticed that detail immediately, but I assumed it was from animals. Small creatures often found ways into cabins like this. They nested in corners, searching for warmth. I walked through each room slowly, checking the walls and ceiling. The structure seemed stable. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but they felt firm. The bedroom contained a simple bed frame with a thin mattress. The blanket on top was folded neatly. I ran my hand over it and felt the rough texture of old fabric. Dust coated my fingers. I checked beneath the bed. Nothing but darkness and scattered debris. The storage closet held tools, most of them rusted. A shovel leaned against the wall. A lantern sat on a shelf, its glass cloudy but intact. A metal bucket rested in the corner. The air inside that small space felt heavier, as if it had not moved in a long time. I returned to the main room and stood still, listening. The silence was deep and complete. No cars, no voices, no distant machines. Only the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside. I set my bag on the table and began making notes. My uncle wanted a full report. I planned to stay overnight so I could inspect the place under different conditions. Cabins revealed more problems after dark, when temperatures dropped and materials shifted. As the afternoon faded, the temperature inside fell quickly. My breath became visible. I gathered dry wood from outside and lit a small fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly. The smell of burning pine filled the room. I sat in one of the chairs, watching the fire and listening to the forest. At some point, I noticed a faint sound beneath me. It was subtle, more a vibration than a clear noise. I leaned forward and pressed my hand against the floor. The wood felt cold and solid. I told myself it was the fire settling or the structure adjusting to the heat. Old buildings move constantly. That was normal. The sound did not repeat, and I forgot about it. Not arrived fully by 6. Darkness surrounded the cabin completely. The windows reflected the firelight, turning them into black mirrors. I could see only my own outline when I looked toward them. I ate a simple meal and prepared to sleep. I placed my flashlight beside the bed. The cold grew stronger as the fire weakened. I added more wood and lay down. Sleep came slowly. The silence made every small sensation noticeable. My heartbeat felt louder than usual. The mattress shifted slightly under my weight, its springs stiff with age. At some point during the night, I woke without knowing why. My eyes opened to complete darkness. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was colder than before. I remained still, listening. A faint scraping sound reached me. It came from below, dull and slow. It did not sound like an animal moving quickly. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. My body tensed. I focused on the direction. The sound came from beneath the bedroom floor. I waited, barely breathing. The scraping stopped. I stayed awake for a long time after that, unable to relax fully. Eventually, exhaustion forced me back into sleep. Morning light entered through the dusty windows. The room looked harmless again. The memory of the sound felt less certain, like something imagined. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, inspecting the foundation. The structure rested on concrete blocks that lifted it about 2 feet off the ground. Shadows filled the space beneath. I crouched and looked under the floor. The dirt was uneven. Pine needles covered most of the ground, but in one area near the center, the dirt looked disturbed. It was darker, as if recently turned. I leaned closer. A narrow depression formed a shallow path leading toward the middle of the cabin. My chest tightened. Something had been moving there. I returned inside and examined the floor carefully. Near the stove, one of the boards looked slightly different. Its edges did not align perfectly with the others. I pressed down on it gently. It shifted. A hollow space existed beneath it. My hands felt cold as I knelt and tried to lift it. The board resisted at first, then rose slowly. Beneath, it was a dark opening large enough for a person to crawl through. The smell that escaped was stale and human. I froze. The space below was not empty. A flattened area of dirt showed where someone had been lying. A blanket rested there, thin and worn. A plastic bottle sat beside it. Someone had been living under the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. The place was remote. No one would come here unless they knew about it. I replaced the board carefully and stepped back. Every part of the cabin felt different now. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt occupied. I packed my bag quickly. My hands moved faster than usual, driven by instinct. I wanted to leave before night returned. As I reached the door, I noticed something else. A set of footprints marked the dust near the entrance. They were faint but visible. They led from the bedroom toward the door. They were not mine. The realization hit me with full force. Someone had been inside while I slept. My breathing became shallow. I opened the door and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The forest looked the same as before, but I understood now how easily someone could watch from within it. I walked back toward my truck without stopping. The distance felt longer than it had the day before. When I reached the vehicle, I got inside and locked the doors. My hands trembled slightly as I started the engine. I drove directly to the nearest town and reported what I'd found. Authorities investigated the cabin later that day. They discovered more evidence beneath the floor. Food wrappers, clothing, and tools confirmed that someone had lived there for weeks. They also found tracks leading deeper into the forest. The person had fled shortly after I left. In the following days, I learned that a man had escaped from a nearby work site months earlier. He had survived by hiding in remote structures, avoiding contact. The cabin had provided shelter and concealment. He was eventually captured after being spotted near another abandoned building. Knowing that he had been beneath me while I slept changed how I remembered that night. The scraping sound had been real. The disturbed floor, the footprints, the smell. None of it had been imagined. He had waited in darkness while I rested above him, separated by a single layer of wood. The cabin remained standing, but I never returned. The memory of that hidden space stayed with me, clear and permanent, a reminder of how close danger can exist without being seen.